So good evening again to everyone. Thanks for being here. This is our second session of our course on the Akeida. And we got off, I thought, to a good start last week as we really went through the text itself of the Akeida and looked at, looked at a variety of questions. Why we are learning this together, what we hope to gain out of this, especially you heard mostly what I would like us to gain out of this, which is making sure that we find religious meaning in this text, as opposed to doing what I think a lot of people have done, which is to sort of marginalize it. And I depended on a variety of people who pointed out that there's really no way to marginalize this text. It's too important to Jewish tradition within the Siddur, within the high holidays, within the Torah itself. And better for us to continue to work through it so that we have ways of gaining meaning from it. So we started that off last week by looking at both the text itself and talking through some of the things we notice about the text. Some things that are missing from the text. We talked about the context of Genesis 22, especially by comparing it with excuse me one second, comparing it with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We put it within the context of the potential and near death of Ishmael, Abraham's other son. And we talked quite a bit about what it means for Abraham to be one who argues with God in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and one who seems not to argue with God. And we talked about the fact that there are a variety of people who hold those two up and compare them, and I think we've talked about David Hartman, Rabbi David Hartman in particular, who said, the real Abraham is the one who argues with God. But as I pointed out, there are a variety of stories in Abraham's life, important stories where that's not Abraham at all. He seems to follow God's will. He carries out what God commands him. So who's to say that that's not really Abraham? Today, we are going to focus mostly on, Bob, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was thinking, the intervening time here, first off, hello, that Abraham failed the test. He failed the 10th test because he wasn't the Abraham that argued. Somehow or another, God expected him to argue, and anyway, that thought occurred to me, so I'll throw that one out there.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Bob. I mean, I think that one of the things I said repeatedly last week as well, and you'll probably hear me say it a variety of additional times today and next week, is it's hard to see in the text of the Torah that Abraham failed the test or that he's being criticized. If you look hard enough, you will find midrashim which sort of ask that question, sometimes make that accusation, and certainly you'll find in modern midrash and modern interpretation people who argue that. But I do think it's hard to see that in the text of the Torah in any case. So today, what we are planning to do is look at this story through the eyes of the classical rabbis, primarily through the midrash, and also to look at the story through a couple of lenses from the Middle Ages, okay? And that will, there's a lot more that we'll be able to say by the end of this class. Let me say that differently. In spite of all that we will say today about that period and interpretation during the rabbinic and medieval periods, there's a lot that we won't say, tons. But this is what we'll be able to do today. And then by next week, we'll be looking at the modern period. As I mentioned last week, we'll be looking especially through the eyes of Professor Aaron Kohler from Yeshiva University, who examines the impact of Kierkegaard's thought on the way we understand this text and how it has really not only shaped Christian understanding of Abraham, but also Jewish understanding of Abraham. And I would say largely in ways that make it hard to find a lot of meaning and in some ways which people argue are religiously dangerous. So that's really for next week. Today, what we're going to do first is we're going to reread the entire chapter once through, because it just seems like, since it's one solid text, I think we should look at it again. And then we're going to move directly to the rabbinic stuff, okay? The rabbinic interpretations. So, there we go. Okay. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, you stay here with the ass, the boy and I will go up there. We will worship and we will return to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the 2 walked off together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, and he answered, yes, my son. And he said, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And he answered, here I am. And he said, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, on the mount of the Lord there is vision. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens and the sands of the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Well, it should sound familiar since we just looked at it last week. But if anyone would like to share something that they caught this time around that they didn't see the last time, I'd be happy to hear. Or something that they didn't catch when we first read it, but after last week's session of all the learning we did. Go ahead, Rob.
So, am I unmuted? Good. So, there's 2 things I think that bother most of us. One is that he's going to commit murder. He's going to sacrifice his child, so maybe even worse than murder. And 2, just that you would hurt your child. And there's sort of 2 slightly different things, I think. So I really have a question, which is, in the Bible, it's not clear to me that child sacrifice was not a good thing. I mean, there are stories that talk about child sacrifice or a parent killing their child. That makes me think that there's only one real issue here, which is doing this to your child, the heartache, the pain, which makes it a much more, fits better to a test. Because now God's not asking him to do something immoral. God's asking him to do something that's more accepted, but yet I'm not going to kill my son. That's a different kind of test than asking him
Oh,
to do
wait,
something that's really
with
murder.
you. I was with you until the end of that last sentence. So say that part again.
That there's a difference in my mind between a test that says do something that's immoral, horrible thing, child murder, and then you add on to it sort of to make it even worse, it's your own child.
So
As distinct
in
from,
that case, wait, I'm sorry, Rob, let me just make sure I
okay,
understand
yep,
that part. So the test therefore would be, are you going to listen to me and do something immoral, right? And the answer would be better to, you only pass if you refuse. Is that right? Is that the way
exactly.
you're saying? Got it.
So if God's just asking him to do something that is accepted in the time, which is to offer your child and as a sacrifice to God, then the difficulty is that you don't really want to sacrifice your child. And that's a true test because it's something that people do. It's difficult. And Abraham, are you willing to do your son, particularly the one you love? So buried in there is a question, which is in the Bible, I'm less confident than I was last week that sacrificing children was at that point something that was unacceptable.
So you've hit on an important aspect of what I'm hoping we're going to really focus on next week. And it really comes out of Aaron Kohler's work, but not only, he's building on others. But let's see if I can answer briefly. It's sort of, it's perfectly fine that we're sort of showing our cards for next week, but I don't want to spend too much time on it right now because I would like us to work through some of the other material that I mentioned earlier. So you're touching on something very important. I would say that, right, there's nothing in the Torah which gives the impression, at least to me, and I think to most people who read it, that gives the impression that God thinks that the test is, will Abraham do this immoral thing that I'm asking him to do? There's nothing in the Torah that states or implies that God is testing Abraham's morality. And the reason we know that is because Abraham goes forward and does what God asks him to do and is then praised for doing that. That is to say, he goes as far as God will let him go. He doesn't say, you are crazy. You are about to sacrifice your son. Don't you know you weren't supposed to do that? God does not say that. That is not what the Torah says. It says quite the opposite. I asked you to do something. I meant it. I'm glad you really tried to do it. Stop there. Okay. So, but the other part of what you ask is this question of the feasibility, the permissibility, the acceptance of child sacrifice within the context of the story itself. And that is a really important issue. And, you know, I think what we'll get to next week is a place which says, which may or may not be acceptable to us, but which is that God means it both times. God means go and do this, and God means don't do this. How could that be? That's something we'll talk about next week. But we can say for now what you already know, which is in the ancient world, child sacrifice was practiced. Did people think that by killing their children in a sacrificial way that they were murdering them? Of course not. Does that seem crazy to us? Of course it does. But that doesn't mean that they thought that they were committing murder. And every time we say that God is asking Abraham to commit murder, Kohler would argue, and most would argue, we are misunderstanding the context of the story. Of course it seems crazy. How could any of us say, yeah, it seems reasonable that Abraham would murder his son? I'm not saying that. Kohler's not saying that. And most importantly, the Torah is not saying that, because that is not murder. We might think it's crazy, that it was crazy then, just like it's crazy now. And as I said last week, and I will say again, nothing I say should be interpreted as being permission to go and kill children, right? That is not the point. but to understand the context is important. And we're going to see next week within the text of the Torah, things which the text of the Torah and of other parts of the Tanakh, which muddy the waters of the story that we've told ourselves, that we learned, and that we told ourselves that like Jews just don't do that. Starting with Abraham, we just don't do that. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. Kathy, Nancy, and then Karen, please.
Okay, you're probably going to get to this next week. I thought that this story was there to tell us we don't do this anymore.
So some people say that is precisely the point of the story. Others say, no, that is not the main point of the story. Well, we'll talk about that next week too. Thanks. Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay. It's still striking to me that Isaac doesn't say a word, doesn't cry out, nothing.
Perfect.
And
Wait,
he's an adult. He's not a child.
Hold that for like 10 minutes. We're going to come right to that. Perfect. Karen.
Okay, so the only thing that I'm okay with in this story, and I just had a thought, is on 22:5, when he says to the rest of the servants, the boy and I will go up there, we'll worship, and we will come back to you. So when God says at the end, you've passed the test, maybe the test was you came and you did what I said, and I knew that you had the faith that I wasn't going to make you do this.
It's not nearly as straightforward as what I said. You may be right, but it's not as straightforward as what I said. Which is, God wanted him to do it, or God, that was the test. God wanted to see if Abraham would be willing to do it. And that's what happened. And therefore Abraham is praised. If Abraham doesn't, and we mentioned this last week, if Abraham ultimately believes God is not going to make him do it, it certainly weakens the test. In fact, you kind of wonder, like, it's a little bit of play acting on everyone's part. I'm telling you to do this, but I don't really mean it. Part of the job is for you to see that I don't really mean it, but to keep walking up until the very last moment. I mean, it could be, and Karen, even though, you know, I'm not buying it today, I think that there are again, modern, and maybe others, but modern commentaries who would say, as others have said, like, the test has to be something slightly different. The test has to be, again, from like, as you suggest, the test really is that Abraham knows that God won't really do it. That's the real test. To like, Abraham failed the test. I mean, even though I'm going to keep pushing towards where I want to go, well, I am stopping now to point out that I'm not trying to steamroll all the other possibilities, except for the fact that I don't really buy them. Like, I don't buy them, but I don't mean to suggest that no one buys them. But I think it's hard for me anyway to like see this as a test if you already know how it's going to end, right? And I have a hard time reading the text as it is, thinking that Abraham did the wrong thing. That is to say, it doesn't seem to me the text thinks he did the wrong thing. Okay, Noreen, we're going to take your comment, and then we're going to go to look at some rabbinic commentary. Go ahead, Noreen.
I'm a latecomer here, but I have very strong feelings about this. I think the test was God never told him to kill his son, to slaughter his son. It's an Akeida, it's a binding. And he wanted him to be an offering, to offer him up. And he offered him up. So he passed the test in that sense. He didn't need to kill him. This was Abraham's idea, to raise the sword and you know, do that. And the angel said, what the heck are you doing? And Abraham did putz around a little bit, building an altar, putting on the, arranging him on the altar. And
Oh,
all
I mean, the reason he did all that stuff is because God told him to offer him up as an olah, as a sacrifice.
But Abraham had never sacrificed anything to God before, and he had built altars before, and it hadn't happened. I think this was an idea of separation. Abraham needed to separate from his son because his son needed to do the work of carry on God's work because, he was the next in line. And I think it was a binding to God for Isaac and also for Abraham in that sense that he did what God wanted him to do.
So, no, thank you, Noreen. I think you still are going to have a little work to do to show that Abraham doesn't know what a sacrifice is and that he didn't do any, we already had the Brit Bein Habatarim, the animals cut in half and I think Abraham living in the ancient world knows what a sacrifice is and he's told to do it. And, I think you have a hard road to sort of find all that you said in the text. I think he knows. And I think that's why he goes. And everyone knows.
And Isaac is complicit in this too.
Who is?
So they walked along together.
Yeah.
Twice they say that.
That's
So
right.
Isaac was complicit in this, but it had to happen. This relationship had to be passed along for God's mission to take place. It had to happen.
Okay.
He couldn't kill him. He had to be, he needed him. God needed Isaac.
We're gonna, I appreciate that. Isla, did you want to say something? Okay, a quick comment, please.
The idea about other people's, it's always been interesting to me that I know in South America, they would have games and they would sacrifice the entire winning team at the idea that you offered your brightest and best and most wonderful things to God. Is there any idea like that in Judaism or anything? I've always wondered about that. And I don't know, you're getting so close in this discussion that I had to ask.
Well, so, I mean, the idea of sacrifice, right? We know from other nations at the time that they sacrificed children, right?
You gave to the God what the most precious thing that you possibly had to give because the God was so amazing and gave you life and gave you everything. And I've always wondered if Judaism has anything similar in that every time I come in contact with the Akeida.
Well, I mean, you have this story to start with, but you also have all of the sacrifices, the actual sacrifices that are part of the sacrificial system, giving of the first fruits, giving of the firstborn of the animals. It's that is part of that, right? And the idea behind it is in part that by giving that, I think religion in general, what it's shared when it relates to this idea of sacrifice is that in the giving is a sense of gratitude for what we have and hope for what we will have and don't yet have. Right? So it is all combined there. The way Jewish tradition sort of takes hold of ideas from surrounding nations and then transforms them is part of the hallmark of how Jewish religion, both ancient and through our history, has transformed itself. So things come in and then they get shifted to come into line with the rest of the religion, right? So we can see that in a variety of different types of things, but we'll use the Passover Seder as an example, right? I'm sure many of you are aware of this, and It's something we talk about a little bit each year. Sometimes we talk more than others, but the idea that the Seder is really based on the Greek meal, right? Of the hors d'oeuvres and the conversation and the glasses of wine. And you can look to Professor Bert Vysotsky, right, who wrote basically a whole chapter in one of his books about the impact of Greek life on Jewish religion. But so we don't become Greeks that way. What it did is then you take that form and you pour into it the wine and also, right, the material of the story of our Exodus, right? So that happens in the sacrificial system as well, happens in a whole variety of different ways. Okay, let's go forward a little bit. Breshit Rabbah, okay, has this midrash. Breshit Rabbah is a work of Agadic midrash, right? There is midrash which focuses on halacha, Jewish law, and midrash which focuses on Agadah. That's the more famous one for many audiences. It starts with the verse from our chapter. And Avraham called the name of the place Adonai Yireh, which is to say Adonai, God, will see. And implied, though it doesn't ask it here, the question is, what is seen? Or what will God see? Rabbi Yochanan said, he said to him, that is, Avraham said to God, Master of worlds, at the hour that you said to me, take please your son, your only son, I had what to respond. Yesterday, meaning before that time, you said, for through Yitzchak, Isaac, will I make your line great, right? That's in 21:22. But just a few verses later, God's saying, take your son. But now take please your son. And God forbid that I don't do as you've asked me. Instead, I conquered my mercy, my sense of mercy, to do your will. May it be your will, Adonai our God, that in the hour when the sons of Yitzchak come to do transgressions and bad deeds, that this very binding be remembered for them, and may you be filled with mercy on them. What is seen? Or maybe put it differently, why does this place become Adonai Yireh? Go ahead, Kathy. Oh, is it a thumbs up or are you raising your hand, Kathy?
I have a question because when he's saying this, Isaac doesn't have sons yet. So it's playing with time and I don't get it, but he's sort of saying, I think, yesterday you said my son is going to do this, that, and the other. And now you're saying my son is not going to survive. But I don't understand the sentence where God forbid that I don't, instead I conquered my mercy. In the hour when the sons of Isaac came to do transgressions and bad deeds. I don't get that.
Okay. So thank you. So this is, of course, is not in the narrative itself of the Torah. The Midrash is jumping off from this idea of God seeing. God will see. So it's in the future already. And the question, what will God see? God will see before him, so to speak. He will remember what Abraham did. And when will he see it? When will he remember it? When the Jews sin. You're right. At that moment, Isaac doesn't have any children, but he will, or it is hoped for. And since God said that Isaac will be, my descendant and he will have descendants, a great nation is going to come through him. So Abraham says, so there's going to be a time when these children of Isaac, many generations, generation after generation, they will live and they will sometimes transgress and do bad deeds. And when you think to punish them, I want you to do as I did and conquer your anger and be filled with mercy. Just as I had to put away my mercy to fulfill what you asked me to do. Karen, you have something you wanted to say?
I'm just looking at it. He's saying, I conquered my mercy.
Correct.
So you should be filled with mercy. It's like, it's upside down.
It's upside down, or to say it's, it's parallel in reverse. Yeah, right. So what I naturally would have responded to, sorry, Abraham says, I would have responded in mercy when told to harm my son, but I didn't. You, God, may want to respond in anger when people do the wrong thing. Don't.
Okay.
Just as I had to rise to the occasion. You might think conquering your mercy is not rising to the occasion, but in this context, it is. Holding off mercy in order to do your will, that's what was called for in that moment. And what I want you to do, God, in honor, so to speak, of what I had to do, is to conquer your anger and be filled with mercy. So if it's not clear, we'll just say that, this is, in some ways, this is the format, this is the foundation on which a good portion of our high holidays is built, right? This is what the blowing of the shofar is built around. This language of the reading of the Akeida itself as the Torah reading for the second day, the embedding of verses from this story and reference to this story on Yom Kippur, right? Explicitly saying basically what the Midrash said, right? God, conquer your anger and show us mercy, just as Abraham had to, again, as Karen said, do the reverse in that situation. So that's one thing to note. It's just what I just said, that it is the foundation of the holidays in a certain sense. But the other piece is just to notice the obvious here, which is this text assumes that Abraham did something worthy, right? Part of what we keep going back to and coming back to and coming back to is, how could he do it? Or did he do the right thing? Or was the test really to do what he did? Or maybe he already, right? This text assumes that Abraham was unaware of exactly how this would all turn out, that he had to strengthen himself to do what God asked him to do in very, very difficult situation, maybe the most difficult situation, and that he achieved his goal. Again, I'll just say it again. I feel like I'm going to keep repeating this. You don't have to take on this midrash and agree with it, but I do want. Bereshit Rabbah is a pretty important midrashic text, and as I say, it gets translated into, into our high holidays, which is to say, it gets really brought into the mainstream. So, we can say that our tradition has misunderstood it, but it gets pretty deeply embedded. Go ahead, Karen.
So I looked up Rashi on Sefaria.
Yeah.
Rashi says, I'll just read it. He did not say slay him, because the Holy One, blessed be, he did not desire he should slay him. But he told Abraham to bring him up to the mountain, La'olah, to prepare him as a burnt offering. So when he had taken him up, God said, okay, you brought him up, take him down.
Great. So that is a great example. And where is it from?
It's from Ha'olato, from 22.
No. What source is he quoting?
Oh, what's Rashi quoting?
Yeah.
Our text.
No, at the bottom of his comment.
Bereshit Rabbah 56:8.
Right. So it's a wonderful example, right, of the fact that the Midrash speaks in a variety of voices, right? So Rashi, right, the commentator, right, who was printed in every Chumash forever, right? So that's what he brings. So you might get the impression, right, that, if you weren't just looking at my source sheet, as you did not, right, you're looking at that as well. No, it's perfect, right? So what you get is generation after generation of Jews learned this verse along with Rashi's comment, which says, yeah, God never really intended it. But then I show you this other midrash from the same Breshit Rabbah, right? I think we can go with Rashi. I don't buy it. I don't buy Rashi on this. I think that anyone who has read the Chumash, right, knows Olah, right? It means for an Olah, means for a sacrifice. And Rashi on the spot, because Rashi doesn't speak in this way always, but he doesn't say, maybe he says later on, what exactly was the test, right? So maybe Rashi is saying that God never intended it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Abraham never thought that God intended it. Let's look at another midrash. We're going to build on these, and then we're going to look at a very, very long text, which will move along in a really nice narrative fashion and sort of retell the story. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Another Agadic midrash. When Abraham returned from Mount Moriah in peace, the anger of Samael was kindled. Samael sometimes sort of a substitute for Satan. Samael is often it's like a servant of God, but when it causes trouble. So the anger of Samael was kindled, for he saw that the desire of his heart to frustrate the offering of our father Abraham had not been realized. Let me just point out. So this builds on other midrashim which say that Samael went to Abraham when he was on his way with Isaac and said, no, you're not really going to do this. It's a really bad idea. And what is Sarah going to say? And he put a river in front of him so he wouldn't be able to cross. He's been trying to frustrate this because he knew that a lot is riding on this test. But now Abraham's already on his way back and he has passed the test. So what did he do? Because he's a troublesome guy. Fourth line. He went and said to Sarah, hast thou not heard what has happened in the world? She said to him, no. He said to her, thy husband Abraham has taken thy son Isaac and slain him and offered him up as a burnt offering upon the altar. She began to weep and to cry aloud 3 times, corresponding to the 3 sustained notes of the shofar. And she gave forth 3 howlings corresponding to the 3 disconnected short notes of the shofar. And her soul fled and she died. So there's a lot to say about this, but it's, first of all, Samael is frustrated because Abraham has achieved his goal. He's passed the test. Of course, that end there of Sarah making those sounds and equating them, that is to say, sounds of crying, and equating that with the blowing of the shofar is a really, well, first of all, it ties the shofar directly to that story. And of course, we associate the shofar so much with the high holidays, with Rosh Hashanah, right? So you have that line, but you do have it in sort of a strange way, right? It's not quite the same image of the shofar being connected to the ram and we are blowing the shofar, God, so that you remember what Abraham did and how he passed the test. It's a little bit different. I'm wondering what you think about that. I wonder if maybe we shouldn't, have this image in mind when we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Does it undercut the power of the shofar, or does it heighten the power of the shofar by by bringing Sarah into the story. Of course, we should just point out what is already stated, like, Samael lied. Not that we care, Samael's a liar, probably, right? Samael's a trickster and a liar, but we're not looking to pass judgment. We already know he's a bad guy. But, Sarah's response, well, let's put it this way. We don't know what Abraham would have been like had he actually sacrificed Isaac. We don't know, but we don't get any indication at the beginning of chapter 22 that he'd be crying out in the way that Sarah is crying out here. There are all sorts of reasons we might imagine that. We could chalk that up to issues of gender in the ancient world, and a woman crying and not a man crying. We could think of it that way. We could think of it as, Sarah just not knowing the whole story, and certainly not that he was saved in the end, but not knowing the story and just sort of responding emotionally to it without having the opportunity to sort of understand that God commanded it and maybe thought through why that was. All she had was to respond to the death of her son. Abraham never actually had to do that, unless we assume, as some do, that as God gave the command, Abraham experienced the entire story all at once. That was the test, all in that first moment. In deciding to go, he had already passed the test, because once he was going, it was as if he had done it. Some people think of it that way. Any comments on this? Hold that thought for 1 second, since you don't have any thought to share right now. Hold on 1 second. Okay. If no one has any thoughts on this, we're going to move to this other midrashic text, which I mentioned to you last week. This is from Legends of the Jews, which is a multi-volume collection of midrash by Professor Louis Ginsberg. He collected this, wrote this in the early 20th century, but it was just republished within the last decade or so. And one of the wonderful things about it is that he takes all these different midrashic sources and he brings them all together and then puts on paper a flowing narrative. It's like you're reading the Bible, but not, because it's not only what the Torah says. But I think what the helpful thing about it is that he's going to give us a variety of perspectives on the story for us to work through. So here we go. We're going to leave that part out. Okay. So we're going to, it's, as I say, it's long. We're going to read it in sections, okay? And while they were walking along, Isaac spoke unto his father, behold, the fire and the wood, but where then is the lamb for a burnt offering before the Lord? And Abraham answered Isaac, saying, the Lord has chosen thee, my son, for a perfect burnt offering instead of the lamb. When Isaac said unto his father, I will do all that the Lord has spoken to thee with joy and cheerfulness of heart. And Abraham again said unto Isaac his son, is there in thy heart any thought or counsel concerning this which is not proper? Tell me, my son, I pray thee. O my son, conceal it not from me. And Isaac answered, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is nothing in my heart to cause me to deviate either to the right or to the left from the word that he hath spoken unto thee. Neither limb nor muscle hath moved or stirred on account of this, nor is there in my heart any thought or evil counsel concerning this. But I am joyful and cheerful of heart in this matter, and I say, blessed is the Lord who has this day chosen me to be a burnt offering before him. So last week we mentioned that, one of the prominent aspects of this story is the amount of silence there is. 3 days of walking and we don't hear nothing. And they get to the top of the mountain and we don't hear anything. So the Midrash, as Midrash does, often rushes into those spaces. And in whether we like this reading or not, one of the good things about it is something that has been brought up several times. Isaac is not a little kid. How come we don't know how he felt about this? Well, this Midrash at least gives one story about how Isaac felt about it and what he was prepared to do. One might argue that the story in the Torah is silent. It has Isaac mostly silent because it's not really about Isaac. But this Midrash makes the test at least as much about Isaac as it is about Abraham. And it also takes away, even as it may create other problems, it takes away the problem of, it takes away the M word. I mean, it's hard to say that Abraham was prepared to murder his son based on this Midrash. Again, this is just one Midrash. Isaac is like a participant. I am ready to go. I am eager to be an offering before God. Whether we think that's a good idea or not, that's a separate question. But at the very least, you see that they walked on together, both before this speech and after the speech, means that Isaac he's on board. Okay, and it's an important midrash, and a midrashic lens through which to see not only Isaac in this story, but Isaac going forward in the rest of his life and the rest of the Torah. I'm going to read another section and then we'll pause for some comment. Abraham greatly rejoiced at the words of Isaac, and they went on and came together to that place that the Lord has spoken of. And Abraham approached to build the altar in that place. And Abraham did build, while Isaac handed him stones and mortar until they finished erecting the altar. And Abraham took the wood and arranged it upon the altar, and he bound Isaac to, this is mostly emphasizing the same issue. Take a quick look at it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Basically, Dad, get moving. I don't want anything that I do to sort of ruin this. I want to be a fit sacrifice. And it could be that, I might, get scared at the last moment, and I don't want that to happen. It is clear in that last section of the paragraph that Sarah is on at least Isaac's mind, right? He knows mom's going to be very upset, but it'll be good. She'll remember me and weep because I'm gone, but I will have served this very important purpose. Let me go on here. And he laid the wood in order and bound Isaac on the altar upon the wood. Abraham braced his arms, rolled up his garments, and leaned his knees upon Isaac with all his strength. And God, sitting upon his throne, high and exalted, saw how the hearts of the two were the same, and tears were rolling down from the eyes of Abraham upon Isaac, and from Isaac down upon the wood, so that it was submerged in tears. When Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son, God spoke to the angels. Do you see how Abraham, my friend, proclaims the unity of my name in the world? Had I listened unto you at the time of the creation of the world, when you spoke, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? Who would there have been to make known the unity of my name in this world? Let me just stop there for a second. God is saying to the angels, this is another whole midrashic thread, that the angels, when God was getting ready to create humanity, they were like, bad idea, God. Human beings are going to cause all sorts of trouble. You shouldn't do it. And God is now showing Abraham as a model of why creating human beings was a good idea. Look what he's able to do to follow my command and proclaim the unity of my name. The angels are not impressed. The angels then broke into, here we are. Where are we? The angels then broke into loud weeping, and they exclaimed, the highways lie waste, the wayfaring man ceaseth. He hath broken the covenant. Where is the reward of Abraham, he who took the wayfarers into his house, gave them food and drink, and went with them to bring them on the way? The covenant is broken, whereof thou didst speak to him, saying, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called, and saying, my covenant will I establish with Isaac, for the slaughtering knife is set upon his throat. The angels are like, yeah, great job, God. You completely ruined everything. You've broken if you actually let him go through with this, I mean, they say it as if it's already happened, right? The covenant is broken because Abraham is about to kill him. And you told him, and who's gonna be carrying this on? I got to keep going. Because you want to know what's going to happen, right? Even though you know what's going to happen, you're sort of wondering what's going to happen, right? The tears of the angels fell upon the knife so that it could not cut Isaac's throat. But, this is a big one, from terror his soul escaped from him. Which is another way of saying that Isaac died right there. Then God spoke to the archangel Michael and said, why standest thou there? Let him not be slaughtered. Without delay, Michael, anguish in his voice, cried out, Abraham, Abraham, lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. Abraham made answer, and he said, God did command me to slaughter Isaac, and thou dost command me not to slaughter him. The words of the teacher and the words of the disciple, unto whose words doth one hearken? Well, the English is a little hard, sorry. Then Avram heard it said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. There's more, but let's pause here. These series of texts are, we could draw direct lines to different parts of the text. One question that many people ask is, if God is the one who commanded, why did God send an angel to stop it? You have some answer here. Michael, and then God, to make sure that, didn't want Abraham to move forward. So God, jumps in. We have Abraham and Isaac of one mind. We have Abraham fully prepared and very sad, right? Because that's the other thing. You don't really see that in the text. One might think of Abraham as heartless, as blind, and blind to what he's actually about to do. The Midrash doesn't see it that way. Did someone have their hand up? I thought, Julia, yes.
So I was thinking that the angels did what Abraham should have done. They argued with God. And which is good for Abraham, I guess. Good for Isaac anyway. Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is the first time that they've argued with God, though.
Right. And God implies that in this story, right? You remember you were arguing with me back then, back at the creation of the world, creation of humanity. By the way, you also have here, and maybe this is obvious and maybe it's not, but what the rabbis sometimes can't say, because you can't say that sort of thing, they put in the mouth of someone else. Sometimes they put it in the mouth of like a Roman. Some Roman was arguing with Rabbi Akiva, and to give this particular theological question. Well, did some Roman really say it? Maybe, or maybe it was some rabbi who was like, man, I can't believe the world works this way. So you put it in, it ends up in the Talmud, but in the mouth of a Roman. Here, could be the rabbis are like, I can't believe God did that, but they can't say that. They don't feel like that's a proper thing to say. So they put it in the mouth of an angel. You're not going to argue with an angel. Kathy, did you want to say something?
Yes, I had two questions. First of all, why did Satan save Abraham? And the other question is before, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Where does that come from?
It comes from the Psalms.
Oh, okay. Because
Actually,
I thought it was a Christian thing, so that's why I'm like, what? Okay.
yeah, the Christians have it too, but it's
Yeah.
in the Psalms, yeah.
Okay, but the Satan thing is really weird.
What do you mean he saved Abraham?
Because it says here, the ram had been running toward Abraham when Satan caught hold of him and entangled his horns in the thicket that he
Oh
might
yeah,
not
no,
advance.
but yeah, Kathy, you're not allowed to read ahead. We didn't read that yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's not a problem. You can read ahead, but let me read that with the group and then we'll answer that question. Okay, let's read on a little bit. I mean, I'm going to keep reading anyway, but this is a good one. You like this, right? I love the way he writes because it just like, I mean, the English is a little bit challenging, but I like the flow of the Midrash and rethinking the whole story. Lewis, can you hang on a sec?
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to chime in first? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, the story is so horrible that a lot of the Midrashim seem to be trying to excuse it. Elohim Nisat Avraham. He apparently had 10 tests, so this is one of the tests.
Yes. The last one.
The biggest.
One.
Yeah. And so it's quite a terrible thing. And I think my feeling is it's so horrible that they made up these other, the Midrashim were to try and make it more palatable.
Well, maybe, but as I've been endeavoring to argue throughout, that I mean, it may be that they think it's horrible, but it may also be that they see certain sides of this, maybe the most important sides of this, as being not horrible, not terrible, but amazing. And I mean, remember, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, and I apologize if that's the way it feels to you as well, but someone in our ancestors, right? There are plenty of there are plenty of narratives in the Torah and in the Tanakh overall, right? Which just they're not put in the Siddur and the Machzor. They're not the foundation on which we build part of our relationship with God. And I mean, this is what it means for a tradition to grow, right? Even now, there are certain aspects of Jewish tradition and Jewish ideas and Jewish life that are emphasized by our part of the Jewish community or the Jewish community today, and de-emphasizing others. But yeah, I just think it's hard to argue that the rabbis didn't see this as a positive story. Otherwise, they might have dealt with it a lot differently. We might still not like it. We still might not like it, but it's hard to say that the rabbis didn't.
For 3 days, he walked with his son with the intention of sacrificing him.
Yeah.
Which must have been a terrible conflict. It must have been.
I agree with that. I think that may be that may be the main thing. Look, we live with challenges. We live with challenges. We are sometimes called to make sacrifices. Not quite like Abraham, but to make sacrifices. What does it take for a person to sacrifice themselves? It takes tremendous strength. And you are not going to find an example of greater strength than what you find in this story. And I have to think that that is a good part of what our ancestors thought was important about this story. But before we talk more about that, I'm realizing the time is sort of getting away from me tonight. And I desperately, maybe not so desperately, but I do want to look at the Middle Ages a little bit, because things get harder in the Middle Ages, as you sort of know. So I'm going to leave it to you to look at other parts of this rabbinic midrash. Instead, I want to look at a couple of texts from the Middle Ages. You know, let's look at these two to start. There's a pretty well-known secondary source, a book from the mid-20th century called The Last Trial. It's actually a commentary on a piyut, a poem from the Middle Ages. And Professor Shalom Spiegel collected all sorts of midrashim related to the Akeida. And it's a classic academic treatment. It's pretty well known in the, in the world of people who read this sort of stuff anyway. Look at what the Sefer HaEshkol says. Now, the moment the knife touched Isaac's throat, his soul took flight. We already saw this, right? Forthwith, the Holy One said to Michael, do not let the father slaughter him. And the angel said to Abraham, lay not thy hand upon the lad. Whereupon Abraham unbound the lad, and his soul returned to him. And he stood up on his feet and recited, Mechayeh HaMeitim. Baruch atah Hashem, Mechayeh HaMeitim. Right, that is the second blessing, usually at the bottom of the page of the Amidah. Sefer HaEshkol is quoting this as one of several midrashim, like a sort of a series of midrashim, which are all connected to the origins of each one of the brachot of the Amidah. Again, this is a centering of the story as opposed to a pushing away of the story of the Akeida. The idea of resurrection of the dead, Mechayeh HaMeitim, which is said in every Amidah, every day of the year, which we another time we'll have a whole class on what that means in Jewish tradition, but at least in part it means, classically according to the rabbis, that we die, our souls remain, and at some time in the future, when the Mashiach comes, God will reunite our body with our soul and we will live again. Whether you believe that personally or not is not the main point today. But what this midrash does is it first of all thinks of Isaac as one who died and then is resurrected. Suffice to say that it is this sort of model that makes the story of the Akedah attractive to Christianity as a model for what will happen to Jesus. Okay? Look at the second midrash. Really not a midrash, but a commentary. When Father Isaac, sorry about the typo, when Father Isaac was on the point of being sacrificed as a free will whole burnt offering, he beheld the light of the Shekhinah, and his soul flew out of him. But the Holy One, blessed be he, revived him. And when he came to his wits and recognized that this is the way the dead will return to life again in the future, he rose to his feet, gave thanks, and sang praises before our Creator and said, Baruch atah Adonai Mechayeh HaMeitim. Slightly different, but obviously very similar. Death and then resurrection. One is out of fear. One is out of wonder at looking, you're Isaac looking up towards the heavens. God is looking down and he's able to see the light of the Shekhinah, and that sort of brings his soul, separates his soul from his body. Okay. Kathy, Abraham, Isaac is the one saying it. Yes, Isaac is the one saying Mechayem 18 because he's the one who died and then was resurrected. Okay. So the next text, before I show it to you, just a little background. So the first crusade, you learned about the Crusades back in high school. Maybe some of you are just really interested and continue to read about the Crusades, but most people do not. So the Crusades, right, is a series of actions, let's say, over a period of time where Christians are determined to travel to, this is what the Crusades mean to people other than Jews. Christians traveling through Europe to the Holy Land in order to reclaim Jerusalem and Israel back from the Muslims who control it. Okay? But for Jews, what the Crusades means for the Jews of Europe is, at the time of the first crusade, we'll start there because that's really the text that I'm going to show you, it's from that time, 1096. In 1095, actually, the first crusade is declared by the Pope. They start getting their stuff together, and they're going to start heading to the land of Israel. But in the meantime, there are plenty of infidels back at home, Jews, those who killed Jesus, those who refused to become Christian. Why travel all the way there before we deal with some of the people close by? And that is exactly what some groups of crusaders do. Whether that was the intention or not, whether it's all the crusaders or just packs of them. The city of Mainz, sort of like the heart of Ashkenaz. When we talk about Ashkenazi Jewry, it's that area of Germany, right, which is where the Ashkenazi community is. And they go and there are mobs killing Jews. And out of that comes poetry from the Jewish community after the fact, and chronicles retelling the stories. We'd have to talk to an expert about this to get more detail than what I'm about to tell you, but these chronicles are, they're probably, some of them are written by eyewitnesses, but it's not like reading a newspaper article. It ends up being more of a poetic statement and a crafted statement about not only what happened, but the context, sometimes the theological context in which this happens. That's a little preface to what we're about to look at. And you will see this text and how it uses the story of Isaac to express what happened during this time. Jewish Chronicles from the First Crusade, quoted in Unbinding Isaac. There was a young man named Rabbi Meshulam, son of Rabbi Yitzchak. He called out in a loud voice to all those standing there and to Mrs. Tzipporah, his wife. Listen to me, old and young. This son whom God gave to me and Tzipporah, my wife, bore in her old age, whose name is Isaac. I will now offer him as a sacrifice, just as our father Abraham did with his son Isaac. I guess I should say, because it doesn't seem fair to anyone in the story here, what I really should have said also is, what happened to some of these Jewish communities is they were sometimes within the walls of a city with the mob outside, sometimes within the walls of the synagogue with the mob outside, but on the verge of being massacred. And it's in that context that Rabbi Meshulam is giving this speech. Tzipporah answered, my lord, wait a bit, do not yet stretch out your hand against the lad whom I have raised and nourished, whom I bore in my old age. Slaughter me first, and let me not see the death of the child. But he answered and said, I will not wait even a second. The one who gave him to us should now take him back to his portion and give him a seat in the lap of our father Abraham. He bound his son, took the knife in his hand to slaughter his son, made the blessing on ritual slaughter, and slaughtered the lad. He then took his screaming wife. The two of them went outside together and were immediately killed by the Crusaders. So, this is not a unique story. I mean, again, as I said, these are crafted stories, but this is not the only time it's attested to from the time of the Crusades. And, what you have here in this seemingly one-upsmanship of this story is, we are really going to do it, right? Abraham, he was asked to do it, but in the end, he didn't have to do it. But we are being asked to give up our child. Now, what happens if they don't sacrifice their son in that moment? Well, he's going to die anyway, right? They're all going to die. That's at least the implication of the story. For us, what's important is, at least for me in presenting this, what's important is that this community of Jews sees the importance of the Akeida within their own, in a terrible, terrible moment, but within their own context, within their own life, and as something which is, I guess you could say, better offered to God than simply just giving their neck to the Crusaders. They, he does this with zeal without waiting a moment. Should remind you, right, of Abraham, who sort of hears and gets up early in the morning and goes, right? He binds him, he raises the knife. We have all of these different images right from the story in Genesis itself. Impressions of this? Anyone have anything to say about this? Great.
What's their purpose? Are they, I mean, they clearly don't expect to have any outcome other than that they're going to be killed by the Crusaders. Is it to show their belief in God? Is it what is the motivation?
Yeah, you could argue that their death at the hand of the Crusaders is done al Kiddush Hashem, right, for the sanctification of God. These people are going to die for being Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And you find that concept first, directly you find it in the Torah itself, but you find the loss of life in relation to Kiddush Hashem. We're supposed to live al Kiddush Hashem for the sanctification of God's name. We're not meant specifically to die for it, but there are times, extreme times, where that happens. Again, another link to the high holidays is that's what the martyrology is really about. All those rabbis who are teaching Torah when the Romans have forbidden them, knowing that they are risking their lives, when they die, they are dying for Kiddush Hashem, for God, sanctification of God's name. The famous story of Rabbi Akiva, right? Saying the Shema, right, as he's dying, right? All of those stories are about martyrdom. This is martyrdom as well. I think what this story does, though, it takes it another step rather than be passive, right? Because after all, I don't think the people at the time of the Crusades weren't looking for trouble. You could say, like the rabbis in the martyrology, they were looking for trouble. They knew what was forbidden. They knew they were putting their lives at risk. But they thought it was important enough. That's what it means to sacrifice. Not always, by the way, not always at pain of losing your life, but at pain of losing something. Time, money, effort, whatever it is. In this case, they're coming for them. So you can do that, and you can let yourself, you and your wife, Rabbi Meshulam and Mrs. Tzipora, right? You can let yourselves be killed, which is what happens to them. But you can also connect yourself to this critical story in Jewish tradition. And it seems in the way it's told, right, to really match up It doesn't really match up. God doesn't say to Meshulam, like, bring me your son as a sacrifice. But he, in the sort of creative theological mood, connects that moment back with Abraham and Isaac. He is Abraham in that moment, and his son is Isaac. I mean, by the way, I'll just say again what I have said now several times, right? This is not a how-to. This class is not a how-to. It is, but it is a way of seeing how people responded, how Jews have responded to this. So anyway, I hope that gives at least some context, Amy.
Yeah.
I see other people opened up their sound. Does someone want to say something? Yeah, go ahead, Noreen.
I just wanted to say, I think in their minds, they knew they were going to die. In this way, it gave their death some meaning and some purpose and, some religious connection, some connection to what they believed in.
Right, and there are other texts which say, we're the real Abraham. We're the ones who really, who really were tested, and we really carried it out. And that is, and in some respect, that is true, in that they actually did have to sacrifice their child for being Jewish anyway. They weren't commanded to do it. They weren't saying, God told me that this would happen, but they really had to live through this sacrifice in a way that Abraham and Isaac did not. Although, again, those couple of sources previous to this said Isaac does lose his life, right? Go ahead, Bob.
Well, a couple of things strike me about this. One is he says, I will not wait even a second. And, if it was me, let's say, I'd be listening while I was saying that, God forbid I should be in that situation, for God to say, well, wait a minute, stop. And so, that was like a cry for help right there. And the other thing that I noticed is he has a murderous weapon in his hand, and he uses it against his son in reality, and then he just walks outside and allows himself to get killed. So, if he's already drawn blood. So, I just don't see why he didn't go out like, John Wayne in the Alamo or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar enough with these chronicles to know to what extent the Jewish community was able to fight. But
They didn't.
I can't help but bring this conversation into conversation with some of the stories we tell about
how they were protected, by the way, in that time was some of the local leaders protected the Jews. They were entirely at the mercy of the local leaders. So some local leaders protected their Jews. They said, here's a line you don't cross. This is my city. And others were afraid they'd be killed, so they backed off and allowed the Crusaders to kill the Jews.
That's exactly, yes, Bob, that is exactly right. And, when we think about Jewish communities in Europe over a long period of time, we often, because of the 20th century, we often think mistakenly that it's governments that have been the biggest foe or enemy of the Jewish people. But in fact, often, as you're pointing out, it is the people in power who have protected Jews, invited Jews into certain countries, protected them, guaranteed their safety. But this is a good example of when it became politically unfeasible for those in power to hold off the mob, they didn't, right? And of course, you have a variety of different centers of power, at this time, the church, other leaders, and the Jewish community. In any case, I don't know of stories of I was really reflecting what you said, Bob, which is he has a weapon in his hand, but he does not seem to use it against his enemies. And that's true, certainly in this story. But remember, we don't know quite what it was like there. And we would imagine that a mob is a mob and much larger than the Jews who were put to death in that mob. This isn't a pitched battle. It's not an even battle. So we're going to have to wrap up in just another couple of minutes. So before we do that, let me say this. Let's sort of wrap up a little bit. Tonight, what we see is a variety of midrashic understandings which fill in some of the silences in the story in Genesis 22. And Karen's point, I think, is well made, that, you know, you could have on this very same verse, right? Rashi brings one midrash, that same book of midrash brings a different perspective on it. And I think that our conversation just continues to emphasize, I think, a lot of people's discomfort with, in many ways, the entire story, right? God's role in the story, Abraham's role in the story. And I don't know, perhaps today, even though we now hear Isaac's voice, I could imagine at least some people feeling like now we're uncomfortable with Isaac's role in the story too, because now if we feel like the story is off base, asking Abraham to murder his son, well, now Isaac is just implicated in the whole story. Or one might see it the other way, which is it ceases to be murder because they are in this together. They understand the purpose of this action in a way which is in keeping with what God wants. That doesn't let God off the hook, for those who just find the whole story just beyond understanding. What can't be disputed, really, is that even though the rabbis, by using the angels, by using their own voice, by Rashi, by quoting that, right, God never intended, right, there is a swelling of like trying to poke holes in this story, or at least with the worst ramifications of it, that God commanded Abraham to commit a murder. No, God never intended it, says one midrash. No, the victim wasn't actually a victim. He was part of the plan, right? So the different voices help build out the story. We find in the midrash also, as I've been saying, the centering of the story in our liturgy and in Jewish ideas, from the Siddur to the Machzor to the shofar. There is, it's very difficult to just shunt it aside. It is not an easy story to ignore because the tradition seems not to want us to ignore it. And I guess my overall contention, which I will continue next week, is to say that the reason our tradition doesn't want us to push it aside is because it finds the story worthy. It finds the story instructive. It finds the story religiously edifying. And if we haven't found those elements in it yet, the tradition is there to say, you should probably keep looking. Because after all, you're going to hear the shofar every Rosh Hashanah, and you're going to be reading the story, both at its time in the Parsha in the fall, and also on Rosh Hashanah itself. And for those who use a traditional Siddur, you're going to find it in the Siddur every day if you're a davener. And God forbid, our tradition says, that we would put it in front of you so that you would think, I can't believe those guys. I can't believe he did that. He, meaning Abraham, or that God did that. That would be really an unfortunate end, or an unfortunate result of our tradition having put it in such a prominent spot. But I feel like we're still sort of wrestling with this, and I appreciate you allowing me to sort of continue to push my narrative, even as we continue to find there are a variety of narratives. And as I said, next week, we'll look at Kierkegaard, a couple of Jewish understandings of Kierkegaard, and then Aaron Kohler in particular, though again, he's bringing it from other sources. Aaron Kohler's working of the Akeida into a story of the role of human sacrifice in the ancient world, the way the Tanakh deals with it, and how the story of the Akeida fits into that. Okay, so that's what we've got on tap for next week. And I hope to see you then. But we have got a couple minutes if anyone has final questions. Yeah, Karen.
All right, so I'm gonna stick with my argument that God, what God wanted was for Abraham to go up, not to sacrifice. But also, if you look at verses 7 and 8, Isaac says, where is the seh? Where is the sheep? And Abraham says, God will provide the sheep, the seh. He doesn't say God will provide the olah. He says specifically the seh. So I still say he had the faith that if he did what God told him to do, that God would provide the seh, the thing for him to sacrifice, not to sacrifice his son. That sometimes we don't understand what God is asking us to do, but if we follow through with what God's asking us, then God provides the seh. It's not our son.
So Karen, let me ask you, what do you make of the fact that God says, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you? What do you think that means?
He brought him up. He didn't withhold him. He brought him with him. I think if God had wanted him to actually sacrifice Abraham, then that's he wanted the same thing. He wanted him to have the full heart of bringing him up there, but not, because I guess I just can't make peace with a God that I just can't fathom that God really wanted the sacrifice.
Okay. Thank you. Great. Oh yes, go ahead, Isla.
Maybe you should go first. But there's another thing that always bothered me about this story, and I don't know if I'm thinking of it too modernly, but I was brought up with a strong thing of think for yourself. Are there any midrashes that talk about that, or am I thinking too modern? This story, like I was always brought up with, you don't just do something, even God, you have to think for yourself.
Yeah, so I would say that there are many parts of our Jewish community that emphasize that. And I would say that there are parts of traditional Jewish interpretation, right? The idea of interpretation is built on the idea that we are supposed to use our minds to interpret things. We can adapt things. The law changes, etc. Right? But the idea that the most important thing, and you didn't say it quite this way, but the idea that the most important thing is to think for yourself comes from Kant, Immanuel Kant, who said that it is you who decide to follow anyone, to follow the law, that is to say, religious law, is a crime against yourself. And it is that, I think, really is the origin of what you're saying, and I don't think you're alone, right? It is a modern sensibility that to follow anything but your own heart, you can hear this in romantic movies and books.
Well, but I hear my mother,
when I say modern, I mean like several hundred years ago, like for the last several hundred years. The idea that the individual makes the decision is the most important thing. The idea of,
but also that you can get in trouble if you don't think for yourself.
Right, but what gets lost in that is the religious sensibility of mitzvah. Right. So if the most important thing is to think for yourself and to decide, and by the way, you can hear, for those who have an ear for like Reform theology, right? The most important thing is the individual within the Reform movement. That is one of the important breaks with traditional Judaism, which is to say, community understanding of what is appropriate is the most important thing, right, traditionally. And this is a simplification on both sides, both traditional and reform, but
That helps.
yeah. So like, again, it's not for me to say like, we shouldn't listen to what we think, but there's also, I think, part of what Erica Brown, who's one of the earliest sources I brought, I think what she had a challenging time with, and I think she's right, is that the idea that we would do anything because God says so is something that resonates with a lot of people. Like, the only person I listen to is me, both because I'm American, because my mom told me.
Well, I might decide to go along with it, but that if I don't think for myself and I just do what I'm told all the time, I might get in big trouble, which we're still talking about this.
Right.
Because it's so troublesome.
Right. So it is very challenging for us to jump back over the modern period and try and understand what was in Abraham's mind a little bit. Okay, last two oh, we got a bunch of comments now. Bob, and then Rob, and then Kathy.
Thank you. Well, two things. One thing Kathy could be saying is that when Abraham goes up, he says, "We will return." So, I noticed that, and, it's part of why I think that perhaps Abraham, he had a real positive idea that God was going to stop him. Also, number two, so Michael and God are in the same room watching this on their screen. And so why does God allow Michael, if he's so interested in the outcome of the test, why does he allow Michael to stop the process? And, God certainly doesn't stop Michael from stopping Abraham.
Well, God, in the Midrash, God tells him to stop it, right? Isn't that right, Bob?
I didn't hear that.
Well, the text of the Torah says, Abraham picked up the knife, then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. So the Midrash, inserting Michael into that story, right, is basing itself on the text of the Torah. God, it doesn't say in the text why God asks an angel to do that, but that is what the text says. Maybe at first God didn't want to be, I don't even want to, I could speculate, but before I do that, I just want to point that out, right? That is what the text says, and God seems to empowers the angel to do that. Doesn't say why. Maybe this idea of, I could imagine a variety of different answers to this, but, maybe God doesn't want to contradict himself. After all, God is the one who told Abraham to do this. And maybe God is trying to prevent him from then saying, don't do this.
He's certainly showing himself, in not acting, he's certainly showing himself to be suggestible.
That God is suggestible?
Yeah.
No, that would assume that the angel is acting on his own. And that would be pretty unusual.
So that's why the whole thing's curious.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you.
Two things. One, Karen said something about being uncomfortable with the idea that God wanted Abraham to kill his son. But I don't really read it that way. God says this is a test, and apparently God didn't want Abraham to kill his son because he stops him in the end. If he wanted it, he would have killed him. So I think the important part is that Abraham believed that God was going to let him kill his son, which then is contrary to some of the comments such as Bob made, and sometimes I do, which is saying that Abraham really knew he wasn't going to. But in the end of the day, I can't really live with that Abraham knew he wasn't going to do it. Because then every day I'm reminding God, remember me, I'm an ancestor of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, that's what we keep saying in our ritual. And am I really saying, oh, remember me, God, I'm the descendant of that guy who played along with you? That doesn't sound like, something
not powerful enough, huh?
Yeah, it's not powerful enough. I got to be saying, remember me, I'm the guy who was willing to kill his son because you told him to. That's pretty powerful. If it's just if he was just playing along, it sort of makes a mockery of our tradition. It's so weak.
It's very hard, right? I mean, depending on how you see the whole story, right? You really want God to be like, here's what God really meant. Here's what Abraham really meant. Here's what they were willing to do. Here's what they were not willing to do. And the ramifications of each of those, makes us more or less comfortable. And the story either hangs together or doesn't hang together based on this as well. Thank you, Rob. Kathy.
Okay. I might be really way off here, but I think at that time, we have a sense of the nuclear family that's pretty modern. I think back then, people lived in tribes and in clans, and I don't know that, you took your baby to preschool and then, so maybe, to me, maybe it's understandable that way, although I don't think that excuses it. But people were dying all the time. I mean, to live was probably the exception. Although I don't know why the Bible gives these people these old ages. That is totally perplexing. And then I think that the issue of Satan saving, it's interesting. Although maybe it's just that one place that's.
Well, Kathy, I mean, but what you're arguing is that, and I think this is the first time we've argued this, which is, it wasn't such a big deal.
Well, no, I think, yeah, I mean, it makes it understandable that he could do that.
Yeah, but remember.
But I don't know that I like that, but
just remember the second verse, right? Take your son, your favored one.
Right, that's true.
Isaac, the one that you love.
Right, okay, that shoots me down. Okay.
Go ahead, Julia. Thanks, Kathy.
So I'm just thinking that maybe it's just a way to prove to us that God doesn't want us to sacrifice people.
Right. So that'll be a good place for us to end. So as I think I mentioned last week, there's a whole bunch of people who say the purpose of this story is to point out that God does not want human sacrifice. Others say that is very much not the point of the story. The point of the story is to, but let's stick with it is. If it is the point of it, well, it certainly does make that point at the end, right? God doesn't want Abraham to do it, and therefore doesn't want anyone to do it, even though he's living in a time and place where it happens. But, others would argue that that is not the main point, that it really is about it's really about Abraham, that it's really about what it means to be willing to not sacrifice your son, but to be, what you're seeing is the story of someone who is experiencing, we'll say it an easy way, challenge, or another way, suffering. What does it mean to live through a period of suffering? And for those bad days when we think like all of life is suffering, so the question is, what does it mean to live? What does it mean to keep going, keep walking, keep going, even though things are hard? Not because it's wrong. It's not hard for Abraham because it's wrong. I mean, this is my argument, and I think others. It is not hard because it's wrong. It's hard because it represents conflict. He loves his son, and he's being asked to do something which will have him lose his son. That's the problem. Not is this moral or immoral. There's no sign of moral or immoral in this story, in the text itself. What you see is someone following a command that is hard to do.
But what does it teach Isaac? He is a major character in it, and he was willing to sacrifice himself to God.
So I think it's the same message, and maybe unto death. Right? Not only the death of someone else, but unto our own death. The story is not meant to be a model directly, right? As I've said, like, not a model for us to kill our children, not a model for us to offer ourselves as a sacrifice, but, as a sacrifice to be killed, but a model of strength in the face of pain and conflict and challenge. I mean, ultimately, by the way, I think that's what I'm going to say in the last 5 minutes of next week's class. But I think Ethan Tucker, I think I've got him on the list. I think he says it really, really nicely too. And we'll take a look at that. But now it's almost 9:15, and you got to go to bed. Or
You have to go to bed.
maybe I do. Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be with you tonight.